So this morning, as we've said, we're talking about the book, The Squirrels That Squabbled. And the pretty basic premise to the book, if you're not familiar with it, is we have two squirrels. One squirrel, and the setting is fall is coming and winter is coming. And the one squirrel spent its summer gathering and had plenty saved away, and one squirrel got to the end of the summer and realized that he had not gathered and put enough away. And both of the squirrels spot what they think is, or what they understand to be, like the last pine cone of the season. And they both spot it, and they both try to obtain the pine cone, and of course, hilarity ensues as the pine cone takes an improbable journey, down and around and into a river and all kinds of crazy stuff that happens in children's books. Now, first off, I didn't know squirrels ate pine cones. Do they? Does anybody know that? You're nodding. Okay. Oh, the smaller ones? Okay. I was going to reject the whole premise of the book right from the beginning, going, I've never seen a squirrel carrying off a pine cone, but maybe my squirrels are just, not that way. And if the story sounds familiar to some degree, it is in many ways kind of a retelling of one of Aesop's fables about the ant and the grasshopper. Now, most of us probably know the story of the ant and the grasshopper, or some version of it. Now, if you go back to actually Aesop's version of that story, the ants spend all summer gathering their food, and of course the grasshopper does not. And so the ants say to the grasshopper, "Did you not gather anything?" And he was like, "No, I was too busy making music." And the ants say, "Well then, why don't you just dance to your music?" And then it just ends. In Aesop's version, it just ends. The ants just say, "Good luck to you," and go off, and we're just left there assuming that this grasshopper probably did not meet a good fate. And I know the lesson we're supposed to learn from that story, right? The lesson you're supposed to learn from that story, is that you need to plan ahead, and you need to gather, and you need to, work diligently and that sort of stuff. Like, that's the lesson we're supposed to learn. The lesson you actually learn from Aesop's fable is that ants are jerks. Right? And if you actually run into the story, you'll run into, modern tellings kind of clean it up a little bit, where the ants do decide to help the grasshopper out, and in return, the grasshopper entertains them for the winter, or whatever, by playing music, and they try to clean it up a little bit. And so the Squirrels That Squabble really is kind of a retake or retelling of a similar story. We've got one squirrel that was diligent and really collected more than he needed, and another squirrel that was not. And of course, through their trials and tribulations, trying to procure the pine cone, at the end, there's this nice scene at the end where they have literally been through a river, almost drowned. I mean, really, honestly, had almost a near-death experience, and just sit there and start laughing at each other. And of course, at the end of the day, what they realize is that the friendship between the two squirrels is more important than the pine cone. And by the one who gathered more than they needed sharing with the one that didn't gather enough, then they both would have enough to cover the winter. And of course, the squirrel that didn't gather learned a lesson, and of course, we're told in the subsequent years actually did gather in the way that he was supposed to. So that is Jeremy's incredibly dry, your boring retelling of what is really actually a really cute story. But I like the lesson at the end of the book. Really is this idea that the most important thing is friendship, or the way we might talk about it here in the church, is this idea of community. This idea that being in community, doing things that foster and build up community, and avoiding things that break down or tear down community, is important, right? That at the end of the day, oftentimes the most important thing we have is not what's in our cupboards, it's not what's in our freezers, it's not what's in our garage. The most important thing we have, and the things that really define our lives, are our relationships. And that those relationships are valuable, and in fact, oftentimes, and are more valuable than anything else. Now, Because I'm a bit of an Olympics geek and I'm mourning the fact that the Olympics are now over because I waited a whole extra year for these ones. Like, I suppose you did too, but darn it. We have to put an Olympic story here. And of course, the one that we have to talk about is the story of the two high jumpers. So you've probably seen, maybe you've seen this picture or a picture like it. This is two high jumpers. I'm not going to get either of their names right because one is from Qatar and one's from Italy. But these are two high jumpers that were jumping for high jump gold. And if you haven't seen the story, what basically happens is these two high jumpers basically go match for match, jump for jump, throughout the entire final. They are in basically a dead heat, and then they both miss the same jump. So all of the ways in high jump, and I don't know a lot about track and field, I will confess, but all of the ways, Michael does, so he can correct me later, all of the ways that you would go about like breaking the tie aren't available because they literally did the exact same thing in the exact same order. And so there's this moment, you can watch it, it's on YouTube, where the official comes over and says the option is if they want to settle it, if they want to figure it out, then they basically have to do like a sudden death jump off. Which probably sounds more exciting than it would be. Like I picture like things coming out of the ground or something like that, but I'm sure it's not that way. But one of them asks, can we just have two? Like, can there just be two winners? Can we have two gold medals? And the official was like, well, yes. Yes, you can. And then the official starts to explain to him how that would work. And at that point, one of the high jumpers just basically starts tuning him out, goes to the other one, and they have this really amazing embrace that is captured here in this picture. And instead of going through the tiebreaker, and instead of continuing on to figure out who, and actually figure out one winner and one loser, they decide to basically share the gold medal. Now, if you don't, what we don't know immediately, if you don't follow high jumping, like I don't, the thing that you only find out later is even though one of these folks is a jumper from Qatar and one of them's a jumper from Italy, they're actually quite good friends. Because apparently in the world of super competitive high jump, there aren't that many people. Big surprise. And if you go around the world competing in like world-class high jump events, you will run into the same people over and over and over again. And these two, over the years, have formed a friendship to the point that they often hang out with each other. And if they're not, doing athletic things together, they're playing chess together. They're doing all sorts of things together. And there really is kind of a depth of friendship and really love between these two that goes beyond just people who happen to enjoy the same sport. And when you know that, what happened makes a lot more sense. Because there's a piece of me that says, wait a minute, don't you want to know if you're the best? You came here. You waited a year. You waited through a pandemic. You are here in this empty stadium competing to show the world and to prove to yourself one thing. And the thing that you're trying to prove to yourself, of course, is that you are the best high jumper in the world. And you are this close from getting to show that. You are this close to getting to prove it, and you're this close to bringing back your, glory for yourself and glory for your country. Why would you give that up? Why would you give up that opportunity to eventually basically have an Olympic record that quite honestly is going to have an asterisk next to it, right? It's going to have an asterisk. Like, yes, you got the gold medal, asterisk, 1 of 2, right? But once you know that once you understand the fact that there's a relationship between these two, that there's a friendship between these two, that the thing that quite obviously in that moment they decided would bring them the greatest joy in that time wasn't to go and prove that they are the best, but what brought them the greatest joy in that moment was getting to share that experience and share that medal with somebody who meant a lot to them. The relationship was more important than winning. Now, the squirrel, when it chose to value the friendship with the other squirrel, the one who did not gather, over being right or over winning the pine cone, that was going to cost that squirrel something. Because that one pine cone wasn't going to be enough to get his friend through the winter. It was going to cost him more than that. Choosing not to move forward on the high jump cost them something. And that's the truth that we sometimes forget. Being in relationship with people, being in community with people, yes, it brings benefits, but oftentimes it also has costs. That is true no matter what the community is, and it is certainly true if the community is the church. Now, today's scripture passage is from the book of Acts. It's towards the end of the book of Acts, if you noticed, and it's in the end of the book of Acts is really all about the journey of Paul. Right? So Paul, who would go on to be the author of actually most of the New Testament, who would be a prolific, who really brought the good news, brought this message of Christ outside of just this little isolated group in Jerusalem, but really carried it off into the countryside, carried it off into the world of the Gentiles, which, by the way, is you and me. We have our understanding of Christ. We have Paul to thank for that. But Paul is one of those stories that is well known and well talked about. And obviously, here we are 2,000 years later, still talking about Paul. Now, I would like to think that I am doing things in life that are valuable, but I don't think in 2,000 years people are still going to be talking about me. Or frankly, any of you. I love you all. Just going to throw it out there. And maybe they will be. I don't know. They may still be talking about Sawyer. We're not sure what Sawyer's going to do, but it's going to be amazing. I can tell you that. If anybody has a hope of being talked about in 2,000 years, it's Sawyer. The rest of us, we're a lost cause. But obviously, we still talk about Paul, and because we still talk about Paul, we can recognize that he was an important figure and all that sort of stuff. But what we can forget sometimes in talking about Paul today is really that when Paul, who started out as Saul, if you remember, that God really screwed up Paul's life. He really did. Saul had a good deal going for a long time. He was important. He was a person of privilege. He was an important person of authority. He was feared, by people. He commanded a lot of respect from folks, and things were actually, I'm sure in Paul's mind, going pretty well for Paul until Jesus showed up and really messed up his world. And of course, if you remember the story, you know that Paul was actually struck blind for a while, and then the disciples have to go to him, and he goes through this, conversion experience where he goes from basically persecuting the early followers of Jesus to actually supporting and being a bearer, becoming himself a follower of Jesus. And we think of that idea, and we think of his transformation as this really good thing, and it was, for us, a really good thing. For Paul, kind of debatable. Right? Because truthfully, the one thing that happened after he was struck blind, even after his sight was healed, and even after he had this experience of Christ, what happened is his life got a whole lot harder. He had whole lot more work to do, and actually went from being the person who was doing the persecuting to being persecuted. He went from being the person who was threatening others to being threatened himself. And so, in fact, in the point of the story we're in now, when Paul is talking, he's talking to the church in Ephesus, which he will later write a letter to called Ephesians. Big surprise. And he's talking to them, and he's warning them about this idea of false teachers and other things. But where we are in the story is Paul is actually on the way somewhere else. He's actually on the way back to Jerusalem. He's been recalled, and he pretty much has figured out that he's in trouble. And he doesn't know what he's going to. And in fact, he speculates that he may be going back to Jerusalem only to be killed. He feels he's in that much of trouble. And in fact, if you do continue reading, you will find out that Paul does at least end up in jail. When he gets back to Jerusalem, he is actually arrested. So he is not going to a safe place. He is not doing a safe thing. And on his way there, he stops through Ephesus and he talks to the people there that he had lived with for a time. And one of the things that he reminds them of when he talks to them is, oh, by the way, I was the squirrel that gathered, right? He says, like, I didn't ask for your money. I didn't take anything from you, right? I didn't ask anything from you, to support me or anything else. I took care of myself. I am the squirrel that gathered over the summer for the winter, Paul reminds them. But he's there on this journey towards danger, but he's there not to just remind him that he was the squirrel that gathered, but he's there because he's worried about them. And he reminds them, like, I am the one that was able to care for myself. But if you remember in the passage, he talks about, now I did it so that I can remind you that we have to care for the weak. Those who can care for themselves need to, so that we can also, and we also need to care for those who can't. Right? And he is so, even though he himself has a lot going on in his whole life, he has so much concern for this church and what might happen to it in this community and what might happen to it and what happens if some false teachers get in there. He has so much concern and love and care and desire to serve these folks that despite everything else going on in his life, he stops to remind them of who they are, to remind them of the love God has for them, to remind them of the grace that is available to them, and remind them of what he taught them before, because he's very concerned, frankly, not for his own well-being, but he's concerned about the well-being of the church. He's concerned about all of their well-being and what might happen to them should they go down the wrong path. Being Paul in the way that Paul was Paul cost him something. Having care and concern for the church in Ephesus cost him something. And yet, Paul does it anyway. And yet, Paul goes anyway. And yet, even though there's danger, Paul goes to Jerusalem because he is so sure that he has been doing the right things. He's so sure that bringing the good news to the Gentiles, which means bringing the good news to people like you and me, was something that God wanted and that was important to do. And even if the people back home don't agree, he's going to do it anyway. But he's also not going to run and hide from the consequences of it. I've talked often, several times now, about my friends and the ministry they're starting, or have more or less have started. They're off and running down in Denver called Free. If you remember, they came and talked to us a couple of years ago. And if you don't remember, this is my friend Ryan. This was one of my last projects that I started in my previous job. So in my previous job, one of my jobs was to help start new churches. This is the last church that I helped get started. They did most of the work. I just sit there and cheerleaded for them. But this is Ryan, if you remember. And if you remember, this church is set up specifically to do something. It's set up specifically to work with addicts, loved one of addicts, and spiritual refugees, which is just, I love that last one, spiritual refugees, what a great word. But that's who they work with. That's who they want to work with, because they recognize that community has, that community was not being served well, and that community has a certain set of needs, and to really make inroads. So if you really want the good news, if you want the gospel to be shared in those places, you have to share it in a way that people can hear and understand. And so they set up this community, and they set it up. And so what that means is that most of the people who gather at this church are addicts or loved ones of addicts. And they speak very freely and openly about it. Ryan speaks very freely and openly about his own battles with alcoholism. His wife speaks very freely and openly about her struggles, supporting him through that process of getting sober. And these folks, I mean, honestly, I think we do a pretty good job of social media around here. We don't hold a candle, right, to these folks. They're amazing at it. And they're often sharing stories. They're sharing stories of people, and they're sharing stories of people getting sober, and they're sharing all the encouraging notes they're getting, and all this wonderful stuff. And I love watching it. They're one of my favorite things to see on Instagram because it is so hopeful and so amazing. And I just love to see, all the good work that very clearly God is doing in their ministry. And then, every once in a while, more than they would probably want to, they make posts like this one. So this is Ryan standing next to one of their members, Kristen. This is the picture that he posted to announce that Kristen had actually lost his battle with addiction and had passed away. This is not the first time they've put a post like that out there. And so amongst all the hope and the good and everything that's going on, you have moments like this. And how they signed off on the post, I thought was something that we could all do to hear from time to time. They signed it off, if you are battling, please reach out. Get help. Your life is worth it. You are not alone. Being part of community, and especially community like they're trying to build, where you truly are in each other's lives, supporting each other through the good times and the bad, means that sometimes you have to support people through the bad. It means sometimes you'd have to confront things in your lives or in the lives of others that you'd rather not. And sometimes you may ask yourself, and it's fair to, and we probably all do, is this really worth it? Imagine a world where nobody reminds you that you are worth it. Imagine a world where there is no one to reach out to if you are battling. Imagine a world where we truly feel alone. Would any of us want to live in that world? I would not, personally. And I'm going to gather that there's a little bit of bias in this room because you're here at 10 o'clock on a Sunday morning when you could be alone somewhere else if you wanted to. Even if you're gathering with us online, you took time to open up the TV or get out the iPad to be part of something, to be part of a shared experience, even though you could just watch it later on YouTube if you want to all by yourself. There's something at the end of the day inherently good, inherently special, and inherently life-giving about being part of community. There's something about being in relationship with people, not just in a shallow way, but in a deep way, in a way where we come together and yes, we have the sacred act of listening where we share our joys and concerns, where we are affected and enlivened by the joys that are expressed, and yes, we are affected and we grieve with those who grieve. Why? Because we care. Because we're in relationship, because we're part of a community. And at the end of the day, even though being part of a community, being in relationship, yes, it costs us something, much like the squirrels learned and the high jumpers learned and Free is trying to show us, the cost is worth it. Because at the end of the day, what could be better? What is better than being around and with people that you care about, that you know care about you? Because the truth is, we all need to be reminded from time to time that we are worth it. We all need to be reminded that if we're struggling, we're allowed to reach out and there are people to reach out to. We all need to be reminded and demonstrated and shown that we are not alone. Because the truth is, one of the things that we know for a fact is that God said we were made and we were made in God's image. And one of the things that makes us made in God's image is that we were made to be in relationship. We were made to be in relationship with each other just like God desires to be in relationship with us, which is why we come here and we listen to the words of the Bible and we sing the songs that bring us joy and we fellowship with each other before and after. And I'm super excited for cookies coming back in the fall. I miss sacred cookie time. Not because I need cookies, I can go to the store, I can buy cookies. What I miss is the time with y'all. What I miss is the time for conversation. What I miss is watching people make plans to do stuff later in the day or later in the week. What I miss is people sharing about their kids or their grandkids or their parents or their grandparents. I miss all of that because that time is special and it is sacred because it is about community and it is about relationship and it is about building each other up. because that's what we do here. So yeah, being here, being part of anything, anytime we are with other people, it's going to cost us something. But the truth is, if we're part of a community the way that God intends communities to be made, we're always going to get more out of it than we put in. Because the thing that you cannot buy at the store, the thing that you cannot just go get on your own, the thing that is not possible to have all by yourself, is the love and the care and the sense of well-being that comes from realizing that we are not alone, from having somebody tell us we are worth it, and having somebody remind us who we are. You are all God's beloved children, whether you want to be or not. Whether you want to accept it or not, it doesn't matter. It's true. We are all made in God's image, whether you want to believe it or not, including that really annoying person sitting next to you. Literally all the couples just looked at each other. That person, also made in God's image, whether you want to see it or not or believe it or not. So here's our challenge today is simple. We are to be the squirrels that don't squabble. Well, we might squabble from time to time. We are to be the squirrels that remembers that the friendship and the relationships are the most important thing. And at the end of the day, that's who we are and that's what we are about. Because that's who Jesus was and what Jesus was about. That's who Paul was and what Paul was about. And at the end of the day, if we really truly want to call ourselves Christ followers and call ourselves the church, we don't have a choice but to do anything other than to be about that ourselves. I am grateful and glad to be in community with you all. I am grateful and glad to have you all to turn to lift me up when I'm not feeling great. I'm grateful to have you all to remind me that I am not alone. So please remember this. You are not alone either. You are worth it. You are loved. Amen.